Dr. Tadej Troha is head of the Institute of Philosophy here at Zaritza Sazu. He is a prolific translator of Freud into Slovenian, amongst other writers. He is the author in Slovenian of Neither a Miracle Nor a Miracle and Interventions into the Irreversible. In his research, he focuses on Lacanian and Freudian psychoanalysis, particularly on metapsychology, the history of psychoanalysis, and mass psychology, which are also the principal motors of his presentation today, entitled The Unconscious Collective, Metapsychology and Contemporary Group Formations. All you.
Yeah, thank you. Thanks for coming again, and I'll begin in another function. So, in reconsidering whether and in what manner psychoanalysis is to be continued, the old joke, in its relation to philosophy, it becomes necessary to account for the question of group psychology as well and its conceptual status today. Introduced into the psychoanalytic field not as an original constituent, but rather in the mode of an associate discipline, group psychology has over time become indispensable. From the moment Freud assigned it a dedicated study, it has posed a structural challenge to psychoanalysis, I would say, a binding problem whose full significance, as per usual, only emerged après coup, so nachträglich. This retroactive confirmation is twofold. Historically, as Adorno's analysis of fascist masses makes clear, Freud had already in 1921 anticipated a structure that would, only a few years later, find its almost too perfect realization. I say almost too perfect advisedly. Such a close correspondence runs the risk of obscuring the universal potential of Freud's theoretical intervention, in my opinion. While grounded in empirical observation, the structural insights it yields are not reducible to any one of their concrete historical manifestations. Instead of developing the theoretical openings Freud provided, we often end up fixing them to the fascist model, treating it as a kind of diagnostical tool for detecting contemporary fascism. In doing so, we risk overlooking those modifications and displacements that fall outside this schema. Not to mention that we also lose sight of the structural ambivalence that characterizes mass formations or group formations more broadly. In my view, the second kind of retroactive confirmation of validity of group psychology within psychoanalysis is the more crucial one. Group psychology and the analysis of the ego laid the groundwork for a psychoanalytic investigation of the social bond as a problem internal to society itself. The question is not merely how individuals come to function as group individuals, but how society knots its human material into constellations of attachment. A question Lacan would later reformulate through his theory of the four discourses, grounded in his characteristically creative reading of the Ein einziger Zug, the unary trait. Freud thereby opened a perspective in which society reveals itself as an apparatus of the signifier and of enjoyment, an apparatus that is complex not because anything can happen within it, but because it is structured in determinate and limited ways. Society, too, is caught in the grip of the compulsion to repeat, to always find Krankheitsgewinn, gain from illness, in a limited number of social-political configurations. And this may well be the primary source of discontent in civilization. So the compulsion for the society to repeat its old forms, to get ill again, in the same way. The binding nature of the problem of group psychology becomes even more pronounced when you consider the fact that Freudian psychoanalysis couldn't resist intervening in this field already at earlier stages, and even at much earlier stage. For instance, if we read Freud's first technical paper from 1890, we could quite justifiably say that psychoanalysis as a clinical practice effectively emerged out of group psychology. The greatest stimulus for reviving the potential of treatment targeting the psychical, that is, a form of healing which, even in the presence of bodily symptoms, addresses the psyche, came for Freud from the phenomenon of miraculous cures occurring within group constellations, on the one hand within religious collectives, on the other in the configurations of high society. I quote Freud here, "Even those who are without religious faith need not forgo miraculous cures. In their case, reputation and group influence act as a complete substitute for faith. There are always fashionable treatments and fashionable physicians, and these play an especially dominant part in high society, where the most powerful psychological motive forces are the endeavors to excel and to do what the best people do. Fashionable treatments of this kind produce therapeutic results which are outside the scope of their actual power, and the same procedures effect far more in the hands of a fashionable doctor," end of quote. And Freud, who never allowed himself to be an a priori skeptic, took this effect as a fact, finding its systematization in hypnosis, a technique he would later subject to a posteriori criticism, but never let go of entirely. After all, hypnosis served him, as it had already served Le Bon, as a tool for grasping the structural dimensions of group phenomena. For Freud, hypnosis was not merely analogous to the group, it turned out to be a group formation in its own right, identical with it, as Freud says. The hypnotic relation, he wrote, is, I quote, "a group formation with two members, or rather, eine Masse zu zweit." The tendency of psychoanalysis to reach into the field of group psychology persisted well beyond this early moment. It is well known that in his final phase, Freud turned directly to the problems of culture. Yet, as he noted, this turn came only after he had exhausted everything he himself had to say about psychoanalysis proper. Everything, that is, that could not just as well have been discovered by someone else. What may be more interesting for us today, however, are those earlier moments in which the drive to engage with the social field remained an expression of the psychoanalytic ambition in its strict sense. In this context, it is telling that the two major interventions in the social field coincided temporarily with decisive breakthroughs in psychoanalytic theory. So just as Freud was writing group psychology alongside Beyond the Pleasure Principle, an earlier effort at a state-of-the-art psychoanalytic framework, namely the 3 essays on the theory of sexuality, had already found its social-psychological counterpart. As Freud himself noted, in 1905 he was working alternately, literally at 2 separate desks, on the 3 essays and on his book on jokes, which can be understood as a study of the formation of a provisional group, particularly in the case of a tendentious joke. Here too, the practice of producing pleasure, a pleasure that generates cohesion among individuals, depends on a distribution of roles between the recipients who are meant to laugh, the speaker who must refrain from laughing, and the object of the joke who would not find it funny and is therefore best kept at a distance, excluded from the provisional group. A policeman, a blonde woman, and so on, right? But for this distribution to function, a minimal degree of pre-existing cohesion is already required. A provisional mutual identification as the precondition for the atmosphere in which the joke machine can operate, a machine in which the saving of psychical expenditure releases a pleasure greater than the investment that supported the inhibition. And here it's not merely a matter of jokes being inappropriate in certain situations. It is also a matter of the joke machine requiring the temporary suspension, a flattening of hierarchy among those present. A joke told by a commanding figure will, under ordinary circumstances, still provoke laughter, to be sure. But this laughter of partial relief remains shadowed by the anxious anticipation of what is to follow, what is next. Rather than generating shared release, it reproduces or even intensifies the asymmetry. For a joke to truly function, it must be told within a group where all participants are mutually perceived as par l'être, as the spoken, as beings constituted by language and equally exposed to its effects. Only under such conditions can the joke momentarily suspend the existing social bonds and create a provisional constellation. So laughter, if we reverse the perspective, must be taken as an indication that such a suspension had occurred, that a temporary reconfiguration has taken place. And if we find ourselves laughing at something said by a dodgy figure, despite our better knowledge, despite knowing all too well that we shouldn't be laughing, then for that brief moment, whether we like it or not, we have become part of that transient situational crowd. And this is always tricky. One never knows what lasting effects the inclusion in such transient crowds will have. In the present political context, this is, I suppose, what distinguishes a savvy right-wing populist buffoon like Trump from a truly ominous right-winger like Netanyahu. As we will see later, the latter too is capable of forming a crowd, though the construction is of a different order. Paradoxically, the resulting group ultimately has greater reach and is far less ephemeral. Let's take stock. When talking about early group psychology moments, I have thus far mentioned miraculous cures that Freud took as a basic point of departure and as an impetus for his therapeutic project. So the very existence of miraculous cures taking place in society, so in a way to mechanize this effect. The fact that such cures are in their essence group phenomena suggests that psychoanalysis did not begin primarily as a practice of approaching another individual, but rather as a condensation of society. Just recall, eine Masse zu zweit. I have also discussed the book on jokes, in which Freud, at the very moment he was composing the 3 essays on the theory of sexuality and attempting, as he later put it, to discover how far psychological investigation can throw light upon the biology of the sexual life of men, entered the field of society and opened up the question of the production of pleasure through language, so via jokes. And again, to go further, with a bit of speculation, one might extend the domain of group psychology, or at least of collective phenomena, to include all those formations of the unconscious, from dreams to delusional systems, in which the unconscious is represented as a play of a multitude of parasubjective figures. These formations, for as long as they persist, construct a provisional sense of reality. When you dream and see some people there, you don't know that this is a fiction. It's real, in the strict sense. Or in the case of fantasy, such as the one Holden spoke about yesterday, construct reality itself as something that at bottom rests on a construction. Ultimately, one might even understand the analytic situation itself as a collective formation, operating in this narrower sense through the transference neurosis, which Freud defined as an artificially induced and provisional illness into which the original illness mutates within the psychoanalytic frame. Here, it is crucial to adopt the collective perspective as well. Transference neurosis condenses all of the patient's social bonds into this singular relation with the analyst, and also includes this relation with the analyst into this singular bond, I would say. There are thus strong indications that psychoanalysis in its very constitution cannot do without group psychology, not merely as a method, but as an object of investigation. This suggests that its supposedly primary object, individual psychology, is already traversed by what is commonly assumed to be its opposite. In this sense, the object of psychoanalysis is neither purely individual nor purely collective, but suspended between both logics. So the recognition of this same split led Jung in 1916 to develop the concept of the collective unconscious, alongside the collective psyche, collective mind, and collective soul. A concept that from the outset and increasingly over time came to take precedence over the personal unconscious, with the collective unconscious emerging as the paradigmatic transpersonal category common to all. Crucially, Jung enacted this shift in opposition to a straw man, if you read this text from 1916. He accused Freud of reducing the unconscious to repressed, essentially preconscious contents derived from the individual's personal history. Freud wouldn't agree. In doing so, he charged Freud with collapsing the unconscious into precisely the register that Freud himself had criticized in others, most notably in thinkers like Gustave Le Bon, whose frameworks left the unconscious out altogether. So, Freud's approach, at least in the context of his Metapsychology, of this text from 1921, was considerably less definitive and considerably more precise. As is well known, he opens his discussion on group psychology with the thesis that the opposition between social or group psychology and individual psychology must be reconsidered. In the first step, it's almost a matter of common sense. According to Freud, social elements are necessarily inscribed into the psychology of the individual. I quote, "All the relations which have hitherto been the chief subject of psychoanalytic research," and of quote, that is, relations with parents, siblings, love object, teacher, and doctor, are always already part of individual psychology, of course. But if we stop here, then even though individual psychology now encompasses a broader range of phenomena, its wholeness remains intact. Even when Freud writes that, I quote, "From the very first, individual psychology is at the same time social psychology as well, in its extended but entirely justifiable sense of the words," the structural opposition between individual and social psychology in principle persists. The field is expanded and an intersection is introduced. But this intersection, strictly speaking, encompasses only the social elements. The strictly individual dimension, the secret individual core, remains untouched. The core of individual psychology is therefore preserved. So several authors have pointed out that the very title of Freud's group psychology and the analysis of the ego functions as a kind of a program. Jean-Luc Nancy and Philippe Lacour-Labarthe in La Panique Politique, and Blanc de Dollard, I think, in the afterword to the Slovenian edition of Civilization and its Discontents. I think it's there. They have all noted that the title implies either mutual translatability or a disjunctive conjunction, group psychology and the analysis of the ego. So this is something that is inseparable. This must be understood as a signal that something more is at stake. If individual psychology is from the outset, von Anfang an, also social psychology, then its status as self-sufficient or fully constituted becomes highly questionable. And this is something Freud himself already hints at in the second section of his essay. I quote, "So, if a psychology concerned with exploring the predispositions, the instinctual impulses, the motives and the aims of an individual man down to his actions and his relations with those who are nearest to him, had completely achieved its task and had cleared up the whole of these matters with their interconnections, it would then suddenly find itself confronted with a new task which would lie before it unachieved. It would be obliged to explain the surprising fact that under a certain condition, this individual, whom it had come to understand, thought, felt, and acted in quite a different way from what would have been expected. And this condition is his insertion into a collection of people, the Menschenmenge, which has acquired the characteristic of a psychological group," end of quote. So if then individual psychology were to give in to the illusion that it had achieved the complete understanding of the individual simply by integrating social elements, it would, Freud argues, suddenly be confronted with an enigma. The individual it thought it had thoroughly understood would now appear as someone entirely different. And it would be tempting, Freud continues, to resolve this enigma by postulating the existence of a wholly new social drive. One that lies dormant, in a way, in all other contexts, and becomes active only when the subject enters into a group. But for Freud, this would be a contradiction in terms. A drive that does not drive, no matter the circumstances, is no longer a drive. A drive that can be dormant, that can be fully inactive, is not a drive. What Freud offers instead is not a new psychological explanation, but a shift in the level of theorization. So, the equation between individual and social or group psychology, the thesis that individual psychology is from the outset also social psychology in the extended sense, is strictly speaking a metapsychological thesis, not a thesis of individual psychology as such. From this, two consequences follow, in my opinion. First, the compound adverbial phrase von Anfang an gleichzeitig auch, from the very start at the same time as well, must be taken entirely literally. We must posit a situation in which individual and social psychology were still wholly indistinct, when for the being who would become an individual, there first existed only a mass, or a mess, M-E-S-S, from which the very opposition between the individual and the social only later emerged. And second, if this equation is a metapsychological equation, there is no reason why it cannot also be read in reverse. That social or group psychology is from the very start, at the same time, individual psychology as well, in its extended but entirely justifiable sense of the words, which simply means group psychology can become a subject matter of metapsychological inquiry. A group or a mass can be treated as an object of metapsychology, indeed must be treated as yet another manifestation of the psychic apparatus. The psychic apparatus, in striving towards its aims, is capable of co-creating a mass, a group. And if I follow the thesis I presented here last year, namely that metapsychology as a theoretical practice must be able to account for any manifestation of any psychic apparatus, then this gesture is, for me at least, not just plausible, but logically required. As Assun pointed out in his La Metapsychologie, I quote, "Metapsychology is not the doctrine of the analyst, it is his compass. It is precisely intended to make psychology emerge from its hazardous character while exposing itself to the irreducible uncertainty of the real. Metapsychology is in no way meant to become the metaphysics of the psychologist. This beyond has nothing transcendent about it, contrary to what the word meta might suggest. It would rather be a venture into the science of boundaries and limits." End of quote. In the already mentioned text La Panique Politique, Nancy and Lacoue-Labart describe the group as a limit concept of the social, as a Grenzbegriff, right, would be in German. But could the group also be taken as a limit concept for psychoanalysis? Could it function as the very concept through which psychoanalysis, in its metapsychological mode, approaches the essential problem of society without thereby becoming social psychology, or worse still, sociology? We might paraphrase Lou Andreas Salome and say, I quote and not quote, I paraphrase Salome here. So, to hold fast instead to Freud's present concept of a group means, in effect, to hold fast to psychoanalysis' right to its own media and methods, no matter what. And that means to be allowed to write with appropriate obscurity its personal mark of X, even there where the psychic organization eludes it, instead of defecting into the alien clarity belonging to another side of existence called the social. This gesture, in which the group itself becomes the object of investigation, naturally shifts psychoanalysis away from the perspective of individual psychology. But this does not mean the fundamental question disappears. At its core, the question remains the same. In the case of human groups, it is always, in principle, a matter of how the psychic apparatuses of individuals can be bound together in new ways that temporarily, but potentially also durably, and in certain aspects even irreversibly, transform their perception of reality, their sense of what reality is. Put differently, how is it possible that under certain conditions, elements of human society, whether individual or collective, begin to feel, think, and act differently from how they had done before? And how is it possible that at a certain moment they admit into the field of reality words and actions they would otherwise have dismissed as the ultimate delusions of the other? So in our present moment we follow Freud, and as he suggests, and if in our present moment we follow Freud and, as he suggests, begin with some indication of the range of phenomena under review and select from among them a few specially striking and characteristic facts to which our inquiry can be attached, we can identify three notable features of contemporary group formations. This would be quite banal observations, but obvious. So first, groups are no longer localized in the same way. Standard gatherings in squares and on streets still occur, to be sure, but even in those cases, the essential action unfolds elsewhere, on digital platforms which both amplify and derealize group manifestations taking place in reality. They are real only insofar as they belong to this hybrid universe. Physical presence is no longer essential. Groups can now form and persist entirely within digital environments as well. Second, because the group is no longer clearly spatially delimited, its contact with external elements becomes more intense and its edges more porous. The group is no longer a discrete unit. Its margins are always already inside it. And third, the central question today is no longer how the individual joins the group and how he changes in joining the group, but whether and how individuals can avoid joining it at all, even passively. Contemporary groups, primarily discursive formations, bound together by post-evental modifications of discourse, are marked by the fact that the binding agent, the Bindemittel, is neither a leader nor a leading idea. Instead, it is the imperative, an imperative that in principle operates simultaneously as a Denkgebot and a Denkverbot, a command to think and a prohibition on thinking, at least insofar as it concerns that dimension of thought which is already collective or which could become collective, that is, publicly articulated. This is not, of course, a command to remain silent. On the contrary, what is commanded is the constant repetition of certain stupid formulations that cement the discourse. And crucially, these operate in such a way that the prohibition on thought appears as its very triumph, as a revolution in thinking, its recalibration, its return to some sort of foundational truths. What we have here, in other words, is a synthesis in which the production of an intense impression of thought coincides with an infinite economization of mental effort, a structure that echoes Freud's notion of Ersparung in his theory of the joke, where pleasure is produced not through content, but through the savings on psychical expenditure. So, contemporary groups, in one way or another, appeal to common sense, either through phrases that sound like common sense, for instance, we can only spend as much as we produce, or we can only accept as many refugees as we can accommodate, or through direct promotion of common sense, as a revolution of common sense, as first exemplified by Orban and now by Trump, Musk, and the European elements of this collective formation, who never tire of repeating that we must simply act according to common sense. And common sense, gesunder Menschenverstand, buon senso, Josan es, bon sens, or in Slovenian, zdrav razum, or even zdrava kmečka pamet, which would literally mean healthy peasant, common folk sense, is in many European languages not a neutral term, obviously. It carries connotations of soundness, as in Hungarian, for instance, sobriety, again in Hungarian, moral clarity, and folk-based authenticity. Identification with the shared formation established in this way, together with the production of surplus enjoyment, so effortlessly generated by a society that has become a joke machine, imbues members of the group with a distinct sense of superiority. And this sense of superiority demands, in a way, discharge in the form of exclusion, in some kind of action that presents itself as reasonable to common sense, which is to say, as the most direct solution to the troubling problem. In this sense, I'll conclude very shortly. In this sense, there is no doubt that the group which formed after October the 7th, a genocidal group, to put it bluntly, must also be counted among the subspecies of common sense formations. With regard to the aim of definitively resolving the Palestinian question, first in Gaza, then beyond, the core of this group, namely Netanyahu's regime and the majority of the Israeli public, clearly constitutes a manifestation of continuity. In some sense, nothing has really changed. Yet, October the 7th created the conditions for a provisional foreclosure of the historical context and for a complete reversal in the relation between victim and perpetrator. Within this frame, the shift toward an openly genocidal operation, under the imperative of common sense, presented itself as the most logical course of action. After October the 7th, the Israeli state was transformed into a group in which, by definition, there is no interval between the conception of an act and its execution. But the group that emerged is in fact much broader. It undoubtedly includes all those global political structures that, in the aftermath of October the 7th, adopted the Manichaean discourse and positioned Israel as a pure victim, as an absolute victim, and continued to do so even after October the 9th, so 2 days later, when the then Defense Minister Yoav Gallant declared, I quote, "I have ordered a complete siege on the Gaza Strip. There will be no electricity, no food, no fuel, everything is closed. We are fighting human animals and we act accordingly." But because the situation after October the 7th was shaped by an appeal to eternal values, to humanity, to non-animal humanity, so to speak, by a call for a compassion with the absolute victim, an appeal which, in its abstract essence, hardly needed to be spoken aloud, the group, in its incubation phase, acquired a remarkably wide scope. And if this appeal soon hardened into a super-egoic imperative for infinite mourning, followed by the infinite suspension of historical context and the infinite disavowal of genocide, at least until all hostages are freed, which will never happen, then it was precisely because everything, absolutely everything, had already become clear and unmistakable by October the 9th. The superego feeds on compromise, as we all know. And here lies the paradox. Precisely because Israeli authorities reacted so swiftly, because they outsourced the discursive process of mourning to others, there was an overlap between two positions that Western politics could not or would not disentangle. And this superegoic imperative, I dare say, reached us all. As misplaced as this may sound, no act of resistance, no matter how resolute, can rival the clarity and speed with which genocide proceeds. It is never possible to oppose genocide with the same force with which it is carried out. And so we are left only with sympathy and with frantic acts of substitution. What Freud called Ersatzhandlungen, gestures that take the place of an impossible act. Anything more would require the creation of some sort of a counter group, but a group formation cannot be conjured by command. Thank you.
Okay, I don't know where the microphone is. Does anyone know?
Alkom microfoon, yeah.
Perfect, okay. Okay, well, thank you, Tadej. We'll open the floor to questions. Does anyone want to start us off? Yeah.
Yeah, thank you very much for that. I mean, that was really, incredible, and also, I mean, it's amazing just to, it also gives us the occasion to address the current conjuncture, I think, in a really precise way. I guess, what in particular, I guess what I'm interested in is sort of where you began and where you ended, and I guess what you'd think about with this sort of account, which I think is really, really interesting, that in other words, where one has to actually begin to think of the problem of group psychology is precisely in the joke book, and this claim, and in particular with the problem of the tendential joke. In other words, highlighting that there is a kind of constitutive violence in the joke itself. And that the joke also allows one to disavow, in some sense, that violence that's being perpetrated. So it gets, transferred onto to the object of the joke, and then produces group formation. And then on the one hand, so this would be a kind of way of disavowing that violence in a way that becomes socially constitutive, but also allows for a group identification to take place. And then it's, let's say it's hyper. Hyper pathological form, in its genocidal formation where you ended, so that there's that where, in other words, it seems like what is crucial then is the way in which violence is being distributed within the group and also then external to the group, and what happens when something provokes a situation that necessitates, let's say, an absolute abreaction, such as the situation after October 7th, where it allowed the regime to basically execute a genocidal operation, which is also then a kind of historical repetition of the Nakba as well. So that, I mean, I guess I don't know if it's half commentary, half question. I guess I'm curious about maybe then the role of violence. That'd be
Yeah, I think structurally, I would say, I mean, the exclusion. I mean, as I said, right, the tendentious joke, they required for this object of joke to be excluded, but it's in a way it's done out of some sort of a compassion even. So it's better for you not to be here because we're going to talk about you and joke. We'll make jokes on you and we'll spare you those jokes. So it's in a way some sort of a very harsh violence and some sort of compassion integrated here. So we exclude you out of compassion. I mean, it will be better for you not to be here. Right, so this is the same logic that happened. I mean, with every genocide, you have this. This is not the place where you will live, in the best possible way, or even every exclusion. I mean, this is the way how European or the Americans or Australians treat the migrants, right? So this is not the place for you. It will not be good for you to live here. Those. If you decide to come here illegally, you will just like live a miserable life and so on, right? So and also in the practices of genocide, it's the same. I mean, it's the same logic of some sort of compassion. So we have to remove you here because this is not for some reasons by some historical acts of like coincidence or whatever, like this is how it is in the present situation. We're on the point that we just have to say, okay, let's just look at how it is, and this does not work, so it's better for you to leave, right? So it's always this, why don't you just leave, right? It's always the same. So it was with Jews, it was now with the Palestinians in Gaza, it was with Bosnians in with everybody. Just like we offer you to leave peacefully, right? Go somewhere else. So you know what I'm saying. So
I mean, maybe I could make my question more precise in a way. I mean, even with when Freud sort of quotes Lichtenberg, where he says, at some point, now we say please and thank you, but we used to actually begin with a box on the ears. He's sort of, in other words, that he's sort of addressing this move of sublimation. So I guess I guess the provocative claim is whether you're putting at the sort of ground, so to speak, of group formation a kind of a genocidal, structure, and of course it can be contained, right? But that there's something like this kernel.
Well, my point, I mean, to try to re-articulate is quite simple. I mean, what I mean is that this group formation, because the Netanyahu regime was so straightforward, right? In this, I mean, just so decisive that this is the end, right? That everything is done. Basically, the Western politics and then the Western populations, right? We had to we were in a way included to play the game of, as I said, I mean, also they kind of outsourced or delegated our compassion for Palestinians on us, right? And you know what I'm saying? So we had to feel sorry for Israel to be doing this in a way, right? So this is what required. In a way, it was too decisive, too narrow, too definitive that it required somebody else to join. I mean, right? Also us.
I think, Gregor, did you have a question? Yeah.
Thank you, Tadej. I was reminded of how contemporary, following this discussion you just had with Alexei, I was reminded at how the Trump administration treats basically random migrants in US, just taking them in large numbers and not even questioning whether they're innocent or guilty of any crime, and then they end up in the El Salvador concentration camp. And the idea, I think, your argument would be that that's precisely the message America is trying to send. Do not come seeking asylum in America. Please do not come here. You will be treated, you will end up in the concentration camp. What I didn't quite understand was, where do you see the role of the common sense here? The zdrava kmečka pamet. I didn't quite get how...
Every final solution is, technically speaking, a common sense solution.
I mean...
Yeah. I mean, because let's say, we Germans...
Only in a very cynical sense of the word.
Of course, a cynical sense. What else?
Okay, but then it's not common sense. Then it's a very cynical take on common sense.
No. Well, yeah, the way that common sense as an ideological category right now, right?
Okay, I get it. All right.
This is, I mean.
No, I mean, this is what you mean by this. Okay.
I'm not expanding, like, it's not a critique of any notion of common sense, of course. But
right. It's just that certain radical ideas are presented as some sort of commonsensical.
This common sense kind of
Right, okay.
I mean, it just says, I mean, I don't really have to use my mind, or don't even have to think. Everything is so obvious to me. I'm just articulating what I see directly. This is the way the common sense works ideologically right now. So, in this way, yeah.
Thank you today. I really enjoyed it. So it was brilliant. I have a question concerning you proposed that somehow we could upgrade Freud's masses with an imperative. With imperative. So does this imply that you understand imperative in a superego sense? And this also poses question then, because in Freud's analysis, ideal of ego plays huge role. So, and do you find such a group formation, let's say, where to find the word, more unhinged, crazy?
Yeah, I mean, so again, it's very basic. So it's just, I mean, this can already be included in what Freud says. Okay, it can be the leader of the leading idea. But I'm just saying, I mean, this is a directional. I mean, oriented. It's not just like, like it's not the idea of freedom, but it's already articulated. You have to see what is obvious, or I mean, we cannot spend less, more than we produce. What what I'm saying? So it's a.
It could also be in the sense pursuit of happiness, pursuit of common sense, let's say.
Yeah. Of course, I mean, I don't think there's a very strict line between those. I mean, everything can. I mean, in a way, of course, if you have the ego ideal, it's always, in a way, superegoic, right? I mean, it's hard to escape this, but it's just, I think, in the very constitution of this masses, and this is probably why they are, in a way, because they're not discrete in this way, so they're not limited. They're more like a continuation. I mean, it's more like an internal change in the discourse, and like some sort of modification in discourse, not as a, like, it doesn't require a get-together, like a number of people somewhere. So the group would only then start to form itself. But it's always, in a way, it's already formed, but it just gets like some, it just gets transformed in a way.
Lorenzo, and this will be our last question.
Thank you. I thought it was excellent. I've seen you working on this when you were in Newcastle. Now it seems like it's all coming together.
Oh, yeah.
My question will be more exegetical and less political in a sense. I've always had some problems with a potential tension in Freud's group psychology, the text. And the tension goes as follows. And right now I'm receiving like dozens of emails, like teaching group psychology, they have to write their essay. And I come up with a question to my doubt, but I don't think it makes sense. So I'd like to hear whether you can, put the doubt to bed somehow. My tension in reading Freud is the following. So on the one hand, a group is clearly a transient and unstable, his adjectives, subset of society. Society is not a group, okay? Mm-hmm. I.e., it is, in English, a crowd, masse. So group is, not a great translation. You can think of a political rally. I usually use with students the example of hooligans or bankers hooligans, Chelsea hooligans, like bankers who actually then become hooligans, right? So it's an unstable subset of society. On the other hand, as you well know, when it comes to making examples in group psychology, strangely, in apparent contradiction to this, the two epitome of a group for Freud are the church and the army. The Christian church, interestingly, whose leader is Jesus Christ, Freud says, and the army, and he takes the example of Napoleon. And those are uber stable collectives. And that is like hermeneutic, exegetical, tension I've never managed to solve unless you actually take a very, indirect route. It seems like a tension. Is it for you or is it not?
Well, I mean, for Freud, it's always like a secondary organization of group. I mean, I think it's quite clear that those groups were once provisional, not stable, right? So they kind of adopted the stability over the years, right? So at least to my knowledge, I think this is how it is. But I'm not a great fan of this particular text, right? As such, I think it's strangely written. It's not. I mean, it becomes really. I mean, it's weird. I mean, it's a. I don't think it's finished or anything like this. I mean, you can actually see, right? But I still think the small moments where he really. What is the point of the group always? I mean, of a crowd or of a mass. So that for that moment you actually don't really care about the society. You just exclude that. I mean, ideally you exclude every norms, whatever, right? So you kind of. It's not only a subset, but a subset that becomes, that becomes the whole, right? But
inside theory, a maximal subset, right?
Yeah. So, but still, there is a but. I think when I was talking about this at this seminar here at the postgraduate school, I said, right, the tricky thing is that when you're a part of this group, you feel like you don't care about society, but in a way you still remember, I mean, this is still part of your normal life. So you dress up, you go there, you meet people, you go with friends, you can act differently, but this is still one of the experience within your, those other subsets of groups, the groups of family, friends, whatever, the political party, you know what I'm saying. So it's in a way, ideally, group becomes objective in a way. So it gives you an objective argument that you are right in doing this. So it's kind of turned into itself in a way. But there is this the moment of continuity, which I think is crucial. So being a group individual is not something that eliminates. For that time being, you're living like a double life in a way. So let's say your unconscious remembers what happened to you even back then. So all the remorse of what you have been doing is weird, because I remember with this when I went to a couple of protests like 10 years ago. I still remember this. Okay, I need to dress up very, it was very cold, so how many jackets? Do we have something to drink to warm us up? What we're gonna do? Yeah. But then for a moment forgot about it. I'm sorry.
No. Thank me. Join me in thanking today.